Hey everyone. During the second quarter of the 18th century, the bold turnings, attenuated proportions, and dynamic surfaces of the early Baroque or William and Mary style were subdued in favor of gracefully curved outlines, classical proportions, and restrained surface ornamentation. This new style, variously called late Baroque, early Georgian, or Queen Anne, was a blend of several influences, including Rococo, Neoclassical, and Asian. This design style's popularity spans from the colonial period through the federal period in America. Boston was the leading colonial city in the early 18th century and the first to implement aspects of the new style. Crooked or S-curved chairbacks, which conformed to the shape of the sitter's spine, first appeared here in the 1720s, kind of like ergonomics. This feature was borrowed from Asian designs and reflected a growing concern for comfort in the period. By the 1730s, Boston makers had developed a standard chair form with a vase-shaped splat and S-curved cabriole legs. With their rounded outlines, chairs from this type represented a dramatic departure from the stiff, straight chairbacks of the preceding eras. The most easily distinguishable feature to identify the Queen Anne style is the elegantly curved cabriole leg. Boston makers produced thousands of Queen Anne style chairs for export and sold them to other colonies as part of the coastal trade. In Philadelphia, craftsmen responded to competition from Boston imports by developing distinctive seating forms with more elaborately curved lines. Revealing the late Baroque emphasis on negative space, the voids between the solid splat and the flanking stiles were carefully designed to have gracefully curved shapes. This always reminds me of the sort of negative positive space tests from psychology. Do you see the white base or the black faces? With the Queen Anne style chairs, the solids and voids are often described as vases and birds, if you can see that in the design. Case furniture in the late Baroque style became more architectural, with proportions and ornament derived from Renaissance precedents. New translations of Andrea Palladio's 4 books of architecture provided craftsmen with formulas for determining proper proportions while offering a range of classically inspired ornaments. By the 1730s, Boston makers were incorporating cabriole legs and broken scroll pediments into high chests of drawers. The broken scroll pediment is what you're looking at on the top of the case piece. So in classical design, the pediment was that triangulated piece on the front upper portion of a building. And here, the pediment is broken into 2 and scrolled. So you see it kind of scrolling and broken apart. It's not a full triangulated piece. So that's what's meant by broken scroll pediment. The standard Boston form we just saw was adapted and refined elsewhere in the colonies. In Newport, Rhode Island, cabinet makers integrated distinctive scrolls and scalloped shells into the skirts of high chests and dressing tables, whereas Boston cabriole legs were somewhat stiff and vertical. Newport makers favored more curvilinear legs that terminated in pointed slipper feet, like the ones that you see here in this picture. One notable exception to the subdued ornamentation of Queen Anne style furniture is pieces like this. So take a quick look. Does this look kind of familiar? Do you recognize it from the Rococo lecture? You should, because japanning, a technique developed in the West to imitate Asian lacquer work, is where forms were painted with fantastical scenes of the Far East known as chinoiserie. Although this form of decoration originated during the William and Mary period, it remained popular through the 1750s. Intercoastal trade brought fine Virginia and Pennsylvania black walnut within reach of craftsmen throughout New England and the mid-Atlantic, and it was the most popular wood in the Queen Anne period. Walnut was often stained to resemble imported Caribbean mahogany, which became the wood of choice during the subsequent Chippendale or Rococo era. The publication of Thomas Chippendale's The Gentleman and Cabinet Maker's Director reflected the growing influence of the French Rococo style, which found expression in America in overlays of playful, naturalistic carving. Chippendale did not invent the richly carved style that now bears his name. Rather, he codified the reigning fashions in England for creative blends of Gothic, Asian, and French Rococo designs. Chairs in the Chippendale style became more rectilinear, with square seat frames, straight styles, and these sort of outward flaring ears at the top corners of the back. Claw and ball feet with sharply articulated talons replaced the smooth contours of pad and slipper feet. Backsplats, formerly solid and unornamented, became pierced and intricately carved with foliage and interlaced patterns. Let's take a quick look at that diagram of the different cowreel legs again. See here, the Chippendale style has the ball and claw foot. These pieces increasingly took on bold three-dimensional shapes and often rested on leaf-carved cabriole legs ending in claw and ball feet. Here's a detailed look at the leaf-carved cabriole legs ending in the claw and ball foot. Case furniture in the Chippendale style was an extension of the Queen Anne style. In Philadelphia, for example, traditional Baroque forms such as high chests of drawers were updated and carved with Rococo ornament like this piece. So, quick test. How would you know that this is Chippendale style and not Queen Anne style? Always look at the feet and the legs. You see claw and ball, it's definitely Chippendale. In New England, where the influence of immigrant craftsmen was minimal, cabinet makers relied primarily on shaped facades rather than ornamental carving to impart visual interest. Here again, we see a shaped facade of the piece that adds visual interest to the front rather than ornamental carving. This is a new furniture form of the time called the chest on chest. Basically, it's two chests stacked on top of one another to create a high chest of drawers. Leisure activities became more commonplace in the late colonial period, a result of greater prosperity and the widespread pursuit of refinement. To satisfy demand, cabinet makers produced specialized furniture forms, such as tables for playing cards and taking tea. These things should sound really familiar to you because we talked about them in the Rococo period as well. I've often heard people refer to these as like a pie crust table, where if you just look at the edge, how you would like form a pie crust. New York also benefited from a surge in immigration in the years preceding the Revolution. Artisans were catered to the loyalist sympathies of their patrons by closely following English forms, such as five-legged card tables. By contrast, the most original American furniture was made in Newport, Rhode Island, where native-born cabinet makers held some sway. Led by members of the Townsend and Goddard families, Newport cabinet makers developed a distinctive local style, epitomized by block and shell case pieces, that have no known parallels in European furniture or contemporary pattern books. The transition from Queen Anne to Chippendale furniture in the colonies was neither immediate nor universal. Outside of major cities, the change was gradual and at times imperceptible. Late Baroque forms remained extremely popular, and gracefully curved pieces with restrained surface ornament continued to be produced well after the Revolution. Nevertheless, by the 1780s, the sweeping curves of the late Baroque and the exuberant ornament of the Rococo were giving way to a renewed interest in classical precedents. So same thing as we talked about in Rococo design. Some people hated Rococo, and so they're very interested in returning to this sort of neoclassical style. So we find expression in delicate rectilinear forms of the neoclassical, or what we will call the federal style here in America. So let's take a look at all these different styles of furniture put together in a full architectural interior. Georgian design, which was characterized by an adherence to theories of order, symmetry, and proportion, drawn from classical models during the Renaissance, represented a significant departure from earlier English decorative traditions. The first buildings in the colonies in 17th century style were essentially post-medieval structures like we talked about with the Hart House. In contrast, the Marmion Parlor, from a house built by members of the Fitzhugh family in King George County, Virginia, in the 1750s, reflects the new Georgian style, based on the 16th century designs of Andrea Palladio and the theories set forth in his book, The Four Books of Architecture. This style spanned much of the 18th century, though in America the term is generally applied to the period between the ascension of George I and the end of the American Revolution by the Treaty of Paris. Palladio studied classical architecture as well as the writings of Vitruvius to devise his own rules and theories for the design and embellishment of 16th century villas. The diffusion of Rococo ornament in the middle of the 18th century, with its use of naturalistic ornament to circumvent strictly classical conventions, also had an effect on Georgian interiors. In the Marmion Parlor, swags, urns, and other Rococo motifs were added to the already richly carved artwork. Here's the Hewlett Room with its decoratively paneled fireplace wall. It's from a house built in Woodbury, New York, between 1740 and 1760. And sort of a confetti of classical details. We see arches, fluted pilasters, capitals, all drawn by a local craftsman familiar with prevailing English fashions. Wealthy colonists might visit London or go to the grand tour of Europe, but the majority of American builders relied on English pattern books for their architectural and decorative inspiration. More than 250 architectural titles are recorded in American libraries before the Revolution. Some, like Colin Campbell's Vitruvius Britannicus, were largely aesthetic works that featured attractive engravings of buildings. Others, like James Gibbs's Book of Architecture or Batty and Thomas Langley's The City and Country Builders and Workmen's Treasury of Designs, provided practical advice for building and decorating in the latest styles and were used by craftsmen who wished to produce au courant designs. Rather than copy directly, most of the colonial craftsmen, like the one responsible for the Hewlett Room fireplace wall, were guided by these books and extracted details from them, often achieving unique compositions in the process. Again, here's another look at the Hewlett Room. And some decorative detail. By the mid-18th century, first-hand observation of Greek and Roman ruins, followed by their publication in wide circulation in books and prints, led to a rejection of the heavy Palladian classicism seen in the decoration of rooms like the Marmion Parlor, in favor of a more restrained neoclassicism. We've already talked about all of these things when we talked about the neoclassical style in Europe, so I'm just trying to reiterate to you that we're experiencing the same timeline, but here in America. The Verplanck Room, which is from a house built in 1767 in Caldenham, New York, reflects the impact of this changing taste. A simple cornice and chair rail high wainscot run along three of the room's walls, and elegant moldings enhance the fireplace surround and overmantel. Fluted pilasters on the fireplace wall establish the proportion of the room and carry a simple entablature that incorporates the window surround as it encircles the room. Take note of all the details you're seeing coming together in a Georgian interior that you're now able to name with the vocabulary you've learned. In the upper left, we see a case piece and desk adorned with chinoiserie and bun feet. The chairs and card table are Chippendale style, as you can tell by the cabriole legs with claw and ball feet and the ears of the chair's back. The table in the back right also has cabriole legs, but with a much more elegant slipper foot done in the Queen Anne style. This is all in the Verplanck Room done around 1767 in Caldenham, New York. A few more decorative details. And By the 1750s, Philadelphia had surpassed Boston as the largest colonial city. Immigrant artisans trained in the latest European fashions created lavish interiors and furnishings for the Georgian style homes of Philadelphia's mercantile elite. The diffusion of Rococo ornament in the middle of the 18th century, with its use of naturalistic ornament to circumvent strict classical conventions, also had an effect on Georgian interiors. Here, you're looking at the Powell Room in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, done sometime between 1765 and 1766. The chimney breast in the Powell Room was adorned with carved foliage that was painted a bright green verdigris to increase its visual impact against the room's creamy woodwork. Some more decorative detail for you to take a look at. And here, the naturalistic carving in the Van Rensselaer Room, which is from a house built in 1765 to 1769 near Albany, New York, likewise demonstrates the impact of the Rococo on Georgian decoration. Carved rosettes and swirling foliage frame the room's arched doorway and echo the ornamental work that frames the scenes depicted on the room's imported English wallpaper. Here's another view of that room and a closer, more decorative detail. Notice again the naturalistic decorative detail and feminine influence that show its strong Rococo inspiration. With the close of the American Revolution, the Georgian period ended, but its impact on design did not. The Alexandria Ballroom is a Georgian-style interior originally nestled within the 1792 to 1793 Federal-style Gadsby City Hotel and Tavern in Alexandria, Virginia. Its designer used a simplified version of Plate L from Abraham Swan's The British Architect for the room's two chimney breasts. Ordered, proportioned, and symmetrical, the space, with its scrolled pediment doorways and chimney breasts, its fretwork chair rail, and its moldings, isn't far removed from spaces like the Verplank or Van Rensselaer rooms. In this way, Georgian fundamentals, especially a focus on theories of order, symmetry, and proportion, reached into the 19th century and beyond. In the late Georgian homes of the colonial period in America, the Windsor chair started to become very popular. The Windsor chair takes its name from the English town of Windsor, where it originated around 1710. Around 1726, Patrick Gordon, governor of Pennsylvania, brought the chair across the ocean and it began appearing in Britain's American colonies. It was first crafted, more than likely, in Philadelphia before its popularity spread throughout New England and other regions. The Windsor chair's popularity was derived partly out of its association with the founding fathers. Thomas Jefferson, George Washington, John Adams, and Benjamin Franklin all had Windsor chairs. The other reason for the chair's popularity is they were easy to manufacture. The Windsor chair may have been the first mass-produced style in the United States. Beginning around the turn of the 19th century, furniture makers began turning out separate components, the spindles, the legs, etc. And because the parts were interchangeable, they could easily be sold and shipped for assembly by local craftsmen around the country. The chair's defining characteristic is a back made of multiple thin turned spindles that are held by a bent hoop and are attached to a solid sculpted saddle seat. So you see this bent hoop on the top, the individual spindles connecting it to a seat that looks kind of like a saddle that you would sit on a horse. It has straight turned legs that splay outward, turned stretchers, and its back reclines slightly. So one thing I want you to notice is the turning on the legs. It actually becomes wider or thicker, like where the stretchers meet them. So just think about that for a second. Can you think of why this would be? Think about the construction that we learned about. So because of the mortise and tenon joint, there's more material needed at the location where the spindles connect. So that's actually why the design looks the way that it is. It's purposeful. So there's a ton of variations on the Windsor chair, but they all have similar characteristics. The example in the center that you're looking at here is called a sack back Windsor, an armchair with a semicircular back. These are ones that often appear in portraits of prominent colonial figures. And as the American Revolution approached, members of the Second Continental Congress. So it's probably the most famous version. In fact, the cabinet maker Francis Trumbull made more than 100 of them for the Philadelphia State House in the 1770s, where the Declaration of Independence was drafted. And then there's the one on the right. It's called a continuous arm Windsor. The chair arms and back rim are made of a single bent piece of wood, which is why it gets its name, continuous arm, right? It's all one continuous piece. More expensive versions for the wealthy were sometimes made with more elaborate carving or inlay or painted decoration. Another variation on the Windsor is the brace back. This variation that you're looking at here has a V-brace added to the back, so it gives it just a little bit of extra support for that hoop. This is another variation on the Windsor, which is actually called a fan back because it doesn't have the hoop back. It has just basically a fan back. And then also notice that there's a little variation on that one on the left that has the V-brace added to it as well. These Windsors actually also have an additional variation called a comb, which is the extra sort of top element connected by several of the turnings continuing upward to a top rail. The reason why I sort of pointed to my head is because it always reminds me of like an afro pick, like a comb that you would put in your hair. So the one on the right is a continuous arm version. So again, that arm carries continuously one piece, with the addition of a rocker on the bottom. The example on the left is a sack back version with a comb with the addition of a writing table that was added to the arm. So you would see all sorts of variations to this Windsor chair, but the Windsor chair is very popular. Actually, if you have ever seen Hamilton, you would pick up and notice that they have a bunch of Windsor chairs all throughout that show. So someone else I want to talk about, Robert Adam, was one of the most important British architects working in the neoclassical style. It's a movement in the decorative and visual arts that draws inspiration, as we know, from the classical art and culture of ancient Greece and Rome. This neoclassical style will appear slightly delayed as the federal style in the colonies. So my main point in this whole lecture is that Georgian style spans from the colonial period into the federal period. So you've got a little bit of transition. It's sort of the link between colonial and federal. So take a look at Adam's work. Notice the classical details. You can name them now from all the vocabulary you've learned this semester, which is pretty fun. And tell me what all you see, or think about everything that you see. You see Greek frets, Roman arches, dentil molding, rosettes, fluted columns, festoons. A common feature of the Adams design style is to mimic the ceiling pattern in the floor pattern. So pick up on that. You can see this sort of X shape in the ceiling, and then you see that Greek fretwork in the floor makes that same X shape. Here we see that same idea again. The pattern in the ceiling, it's not identical, but it's reflected or sort of mirrored in the floor. And again here, really typical of Adam's ceiling design, this music room ceiling has a central rondelle. Sometimes that central rondelle is enhanced by a chandelier, as you see here, or a decorative detail, or a skylight like we saw in the previous slides. Here, there's also 10 satellite rondelles depicting the 9 muses and Minerva from the Ovid. So again, that Greek and classical inspiration. The configuration was inspired by the painted vault in a bath in the Palace of Augustus. It is echoed in the carpet by rosettes. This ceiling was designed by the Adams for 66 Russell Square in London, but has a really interesting future to it. Many years later, 3 months prior to the demolition of the building, the ceiling was actually removed. It was purchased in 1909 by Percy Rivington Pine, a prominent NYC financier, for the decoration of the salon in his new red brick house at 680 Park Avenue at a price tag of $2.1 million. Think about that, $2.1 million in 1909. The ceiling remains today in one of the many spaces in the house that's used as an event rental space. So, to this day, if you wanted to throw an event at 680 Park Avenue, you could stand underneath an Adams ceiling. Like Chippendale, George Hepplewhite was recognized after his design book was published. Unfortunately, Hepplewhite's book was published in 1787 after he died. There is no known existing furniture to have been made by him, only pieces made in the Hepplewhite style. Hepplewhite illustrated chairs with perforated backs in shield, oval, or heart shapes. Here are more line drawings from his book of his shield back style chairs with arms. Hepplewhite has a tendency to use Marlborough legs, which are usually square, although sometimes they're round, tapered, are carved with parallel lines of reading, and classically they end in a spade foot, kind of like a little block of spade at the bottom. He often mixed these style legs on the front with saber legs, which splay out on the back. And then this is the design for a settee that uses the same shield back style. These examples again show the Marlborough legs on the front with saber legs on the back. The left chair has the Hepplewhite shield back, and the chair on the right has the interlaced heart-shaped back that he's known for. That's one that I always think about as Hepplewhite heart, so just remembering the H and the H. These are more examples of a side and armchair with the interlaced heart-shaped back. This is an example of a Hepplewhite oval back chair. The page from his book on the bottom left shows illustrations for the design of two oval back styles in the bottom left and right-hand corners. The page also shows a tea tray, a girandole mirror, and tea table designs. Hepplewhite also designed fully upholstered seating pieces, like this wingback easy chair and stool, as well as elaborately draped beds. So just take a note of that Marlborough leg with spade foot. This is what makes this wingback chair different from a wingback chair in, say, the William and Mary or Baroque style. So oftentimes when we're looking at these different furniture forms, it's looking at the feet that tells us what style it's from. For case goods, Hepplewhite designed wardrobes, small tables, washstands, and night tables that incorporated a space for covered chamber pots, as well as break front bookcases, which you see shown on the right. The very depth of the break front bookcase is what creates visual interest. Thomas Sheridan's name is almost interchangeable with Hepplewhite's. Although he had training as a cabinet maker and draftsman, it's unlikely he had his own workshop. His publication, The Cabinet Maker and Upholsterer's Drawing Book, was published in 1792. It was marketed primarily to the trade. Like Hepplewhite, there is no existing furniture known to have been actually made by him. The main difference between Sheridan's chairs and Hepplewhite's chairs is the use of an additional stretcher on the backs, like these shield designs. So you'll see the shield and an extra stretcher across the bottom. Also, more of Sheridan's chairs had a square back, and again, with the extra stretcher at the bottom. So one of the ways that I remember this is Sheridan stretcher, so SS. Remembering that he is the one that has the extra stretcher in his designs. Here's more Sheridan chair back styles. You can see backs for painted chairs, backs for parlor chairs, but again, you see more square-shaped backs and even the shield designs have an extra stretcher. Here's a photograph of a chair done in the Sheridan style also. Square back with a stretcher, Marlboro front legs, no spade, and saber black back legs. So I found a picture of these chairs from an estate auction in York, Maine. They were listed as Hepplewhite side chairs. So take a closer look and tell me what you think. Sometimes it's hard to discern with these estate pieces if the person who is telling you what they are actually knows what they're talking about. In this case, I would question the chair on the left because it is a more square-shaped back. It has the extra stretcher. I would be willing to bet that it's really a Sheridan-style chair. The one on the right, however, has the shield back, no extra stretcher, and I would say that they're probably right on with calling that a Hepplewhite style. Sheridan was also an ingenious inventor of furniture gadgetry and illustrates many complex designs, such as dressing tables with pull-out compartments and swinging mirrors, tables with uplift storage compartments, and a library table that you're looking at here that opens into a ladder. The illustration on the right is from Thomas Sheridan's The Cabinet Maker and Upholsterer's Drawing Book, which shows an oval table with inlaid veneer surfaces. Slides can be pulled out from each end to open up into easel stands that support large and heavy books that wealthy book collectors would have. The writing table on the left, usually called a Carlton house desk, is also a Sheridan development. He also appears to be the inventor of twin beds. So I think he's sort of like the Inspector Gadget of furniture design. This is a Thomas Sheridan design from his book, The Cabinet Dictionary from 1803. It's a folding camp bed, designed for generals on military campaigns. The beds could be assembled and disassembled easily as the encampments moved, and the canopies were covered with netting to keep insects out, and the sides were draped for warmth. So, as we wrap up this lecture, get ready for revolution because the colonies are about to become an independent nation in the federal period.